To recap a little bit, I studied intruder attack tools as part of the artifact analysis team at CERT. What I wanted to talk about is provide a couple of highlights on the trends that we've seen in terms of DOS attack technology and the direction it's headed in the last couple of years since distributed denial of service tools really became widespread use. What I'm not going to talk about is solutions to denial of service issues. We're going to focus on the technology involved in executing denial of service attacks and provide some background for discussion within this community. Provide a little historical context. Prior to 1999, a lot of the denial of service tools were primarily single source, single target tools, your standard SYN flutter, UDP flutter type tools. The state of the art was pretty much how do I execute a DOS attack without getting caught. Thus IP address spoofing, source address spoofing was used quite a bit. More effective attacks employed packet amplification techniques such as Smurf or Fraggle, those types of tools. Deployment of the tools themselves, the state of the art was typically using some sort of a scanner on a widespread basis to identify potentially vulnerable systems, and then take a list of those systems and hand install a set of attack tools or to use to actually launch denial of service attacks. Primarily, we saw those tools installed on Unix systems. A lot of that installation was done by hand, so it was a very time-consuming process. And in 1999, we saw the advent of DDoS tools in July of 99, which of course are multiple source, single target tools for the most part. The DDoS networks themselves, we use the term handler to refer to the controlling portion of it, and agent to refer to what a lot of people call zombies. So you'll hear me use those terms. The deployment of DDoS tools was largely scripted installation. We've gone from the point of widespread scanning to identify hosts to incorporating the actual exploitation and deployment of tools onto hosts in an automated fashion. Again, primarily on Unix systems as the targets. The use of the DDoS tools, instead of an intruder hand installing a tool on a machine and then while on that machine executing a command to start the attack, there was a set of custom protocols and communication channels that the tools would use to communicate with different, the handlers talking to the agent and the intruder talking to the handler. For the most part, some of those communication methods were pretty easy to detect within a network because they used non-standard service ports and protocols that had fixed data portions. The other important point here is that a lot of the hooks for holding together the DDoS networks were hard-coded into the agents, particularly the agents. The agents would have to have a list of IP addresses for the handlers, and once you found an agent, it was pretty easy to go back and find the handler and disable the entire network. Since 1999, provide kind of a brief timeline. Of course, there was the infamous DDoS attacks of February 2000 that really brought broader awareness through the mainstream media of DDoS. We also saw DNS amplification attacks be used pretty frequently. Various tools developed. In late 2000, we saw IRC becoming the handler for DDoS networks, and we'll talk some more about that. We also saw DDoS tools migrate into the Windows environment versus the traditional Unix environment. 2001 has pretty much been the year of the worm. The automation has progressed from not only scanning, exploitation, and deployment, but also repeat. We'll talk a little bit more about deployment of DDoS tools. Obviously, we've seen a greater degree of automation in the technology that can be used to deploy denial of service tools in the form of self-propagating worms. We've really seen three types of propagation models evolve out of this. Central source propagation is primarily used by the lionworm, and we've seen this model previously, but not in the degree of automation that the lionworm used. Essentially, it's a central source that has a copy of the malicious code, and some mechanism, a wget or RPC or something like that, is used by the code to retrieve a copy from the central source, install it on the compromised victim host, and reinitiate the attack sequence. The downfall of this model, of course, is once the central source is disabled, the cycle pretty much stops. That's good for us, bad for the intruder tools. I should mention from an attacker standpoint, the advantage of this model is I can change the code at the central source, and my attack tool suddenly is different as it propagates across the network. Back-channel propagation was primarily used by the ramen worm, which, by the way, was pretty much the first widespread instance of all of the stages of deployment being automated. It used a back-channel propagation where, after the attacking host compromised the victim host, it would, using in some cases a full-blown web server on the attacking host, serve a file, a set of tools back to the victim. The tools would be installed, and the attack cycle would be initiated again. And this is a pretty effective method of spreading code. However, it relies pretty heavily on having some mechanism on the victim host to retrieve that file. We've actually seen tools that code their own file retrieval mechanisms, their own, essentially an HTTP client. So if the system doesn't have links and it doesn't have wget, it can drop its own code, compile it, and still have a method to retrieve the file from the back channel. From the attacker standpoint, kind of the downside of this model is once the code's out there, it's not going to change. It's a static propagation. Code Red and Code Red 2 we saw, and like the Morris worm before it in 1988, saw autonomous propagation, where the exploit itself injects code that causes the attack cycle to reinitiate. There is no external source to retrieve the malicious code from. And as all of you very well know, this is a very efficient method that enables very quick propagation. Outside of automation, we kind of you can think about deployment in terms of how are you going to target which hosts you want to deploy tools on. You can split that somewhat into blind targeting and selective targeting. In the case of a Code Red, it's very much blind targeting. The automation level is very high. The nature of the attack or the deployment tool is very vulnerability specific in most cases. Some deployment methods will incorporate multiple vulnerabilities, but by and large, the life cycle of the vulnerability dictates how long and how successful that particular deployment tool will work. With selective targeting, the automation and vulnerability specificity might be a little lower. They might be high, but there's usually other criteria at play in terms of what hosts I want to target for deployment of my tools. Again, blind targeting just kind of underscores the point that it's tied to particular vulnerabilities. The life cycle on vulnerabilities we're still seeing anywhere from 2 to 3 years. So these types of automated deployments are very effective over long periods of time. Selective targeting, I'll talk about a couple of different patterns we've seen emerge One in particular is that Windows end users are being increasingly targeted. Traditionally, the widespread attacks that involve Windows end users have tended to be social engineering attacks, your email attachment type attacks, which, by the way, we haven't really seen be used to deploy denial of service tools. They're basically any DOS type issues have been a result of the email propagation itself. You guys probably are well aware of a lot of the reasons why this happens. One I'd like to point out is the well-known net blocks. There is evidence to suggest that the intruder community is well aware of the fact that there are large Windows end-user populations associated with some well-known net blocks, large internet service providers that are known to have large Windows populations in their end-user base. And we have seen scanning targeting those user bases. If I'm an intruder and I want to install my tools on Windows machines, it's very easy to find subsets of the network to look. Because of the increase in selective targeting Windows end users, we produced a tech tip aimed at the home user, which is somewhat out of line for the documents that CERT produces, discussing home network security. And if you haven't seen that or aren't aware of it, screensaver, I would encourage you to look at it and consider if it's appropriate for use within your constituencies. The other thing we're seeing that's quite a bit more disturbing is routers being increasingly targeted. Currently, what we see is routers primarily with default or weak passwords being compromised by intruders and used as a source for scanning activities, as a proxy, as a bounce point to get onto an IRC network. If you think about it, there's rivalries within the intruder community, and that's the source, the origin point for a lot of denial of service attacks. And if I'm an intruder and I want to be well protected against people DOSing me, a router is somewhat better than an end host. So they're a little more resilient because they're more embedded in the infrastructure. We've also seen routers used to generate packet flood attacks. But the scarier thing is in the reconfiguration of the routers themselves. There are public guides available out there that anyone can download that say, after you've compromised the router, here's the things you can do to reconfigure it for your own purposes. What we're concerned about is that turning into routing protocol attacks. If I can get into router X and start changing BGP announcements, bad things can happen. There is public discussion about routing protocol attacks going on at conferences such as DEF CON and the Black Hat briefings. So this is stuff that's being talked about not only within the security community but also within the intruder community. Switch gears a little bit to the use of DDoS or DOS tools once they're installed, primarily talking about distributed denial of service attack tools. I should note we still see a lot of the single source, single destination tools, the SYN flooders, DDP flooders, ICMP floods. We still see that kind of traffic. But there's some interesting things happening in the DDoS tool evolution that are worth note. This is a graphic showing the traditional or classic DDoS model where an intruder communicates with a handler or one or more handlers, and those handlers then have knowledge of a group of agents which they can send commands to the agents to cause them to launch attacks against a victim in a coordinated fashion. What we're seeing is the handler actually become IRC servers. Intruders are developing tools that center around IRC servers and IRC networks as the handler portion. And that has several ramifications. Whereas the communications in something like Trino or Stockeldrot was customized protocols running on non-standard ports, now the communication channels are buried within legitimate traffic. The agents themselves, the agents get installed on a compromised system, and they originate a connection back to an IRC server using standard ports mixed in with legitimate traffic. There are no listeners on those agents. There are scanners available that will go out and find Trino and go out and find Stockeldraht agents listening on compromised machines. With an IRC-based agent, there is no such listener. You can't scan for it. So they're much more difficult to identify. The infrastructure of a DDoS network centered around IRC is more survivable than what you would find in previous tools. The agent no longer needs to maintain a list of DDoS handlers. It does perhaps have to know about some IRC servers, but it's much more difficult to remove an IRC server from the network than it is a arbitrary host that's running a DDoS handler program. For the most part, the agents have become disposable. If one of in a Trino or a Stockeldraht DDoS network, if one of the agents was discovered, it usually quickly led to the demise of the entire DDoS network, which, by the way, took about 3 weeks to deploy. With IRC-based agents and the level of automation that exists, deployment's relatively easy. It's relatively fast. So if one agent's compromised, chances are my network's not going to go away. My DDoS network's not going to go away very soon. And if it does, it's relatively easy to deploy a new one. We also see, in terms of identity obfuscation, with public IRC networks, it is possible to eventually get back and disable the network and figure out origin points for the DDoS networks. So we do see private IRC servers used, which of course make that process more difficult. The agents themselves, when based around an IRC network, the control channel is typically an IRC channel, connection to one or more IRC servers and then joining a particular channel. There are mechanisms built into many of the agents that enable an intruder to issue an IRC command, and all of the agents switch to a different channel, or even switch to a different IRC server, or even make an HTTP request and go off and download a new module to change the functionality. So maintenance by the intruder of the DDoS network is becoming easier, something they work on. We've also seen, with kind of the redirection concept, floating domains, what we call floating domains used. That's a domain name registered with obviously false contact information, perhaps using stolen credit card information, where the intruder can set up A records, hard code that A record into their DDoS agent, and simply change the A record to redirect where those agents connect when they establish a connection back to the IRC network, IRC server. We've also seen less emphasis on forged packet characteristics, IP spoofing, mangling different bits in the IP header. There's really no need to do so. Fancy packets just aren't needed to consume a lot of bandwidth, especially when you've got a couple of dozen or a couple of hundred agents from which you can originate those attacks. So the trend that goes along with that is the use of legitimate traffic to execute denial of service attacks. More and more, the tools, instead of randomizing the destination ports to make it harder to filter, simply use a protocol that you're normally seeing on your network anyway, and you can't filter effectively. That's becoming more common. In fact, it's almost to the point where the trend is towards protocol-specific attacks, and that's of concern, especially considering the trend towards selectively targeting routers and the possibility of routing protocol attacks. Impact-wise, denial of service is still denial of service. However, the bars is being raised on how much bandwidth can be consumed. What we're really seeing is increases in collateral damage of the blast radius. Through NIMDA and Code Red, we've heard reports of backup systems being impacted because suddenly there's a large increase in log file volume, and we're not able to complete backups of critical systems. There's financial impact in the areas of sites that use measured usage circuits to upstream providers. You've got shared data centers, and one of those components is under a high-scale DDoS attack. There's impact on other components within the data center, and of course, many people reported seeing widespread ARP storms. I shouldn't say widespread, localized ARP storms in response to the scanning activity that things like NIMDA and Code Red generated. The other thing that's happened with Code Red and NIMDA is what we would consider deployment technology is becoming the denial of service attack because it is automated to such a high degree. What we're not seeing is changes to the fundamental model that enables denial of service. The internet is still made up of limited consumable resources, and security is still very independent. My exposure to denial of service has nothing to do with how rigorously I protect my network from intrusion. It has to do with how well you protect your network from intrusion. And that's both of those aspects are very difficult to overcome. We're not seeing much in the way of advancements in attack payload and packet floods. There's little incentive to improve. The standard SYN flood is pretty effective. The other aspect here is there are a limited number of bits to twiddle in the IP header, and most permutations have been tried. So the ones that work are the ones that are in use. And unfortunately, we're not seeing a much decrease in launch point availability. The number of systems on the internet that are vulnerable to being compromised and used to launch attacks on other systems is still high. The model of announcing vulnerabilities and patches for vulnerabilities and getting the globe to install patches is not a real effective model. However, that's the state of the art. The vulnerability lifecycle, we still see systems compromised through vulnerabilities that were patched 3 years ago, and that's actually pretty typical based on the data that we gather. Much of the information I've discussed here and more is actually contained in the paper that was published this past Friday. It's available on the CERT website. Neil Long, Rob Thomas, and George Weaver contributed quite a bit to the paper. In fact, Rob and George are here today and for the next couple of days. So if you see it, why don't you guys raise your hand? There they are. So if you see us wandering around the hallways and have any questions regarding any of this stuff, feel free to ask. And if we have a minute or two, I'll take some questions now.
I'm just curious if there is any evidence that there's going to be a switch at any point from demonstrating what can be done to actually do damage. And it seems that we've been fortunate that most of these attacks so far have just demonstrated vulnerabilities. They haven't really done anything damaging in terms of deleting things on the machines that they compromise or taking the network down, other than maybe there's some specific sites. I'm curious if there's any indication that that's going to be changed in the near future.
Sure. The question to repeat was, if we foresee any change in the, I guess I'm going to rephrase a little bit, in the deployment technology to actually cause damage, to delete files off the systems or do something other than just propagate. Am I understanding your question correctly? Okay. It's speculation. We usually don't speculate a whole lot, but I would expect some of the high automation techniques to eventually result in things that cause greater damage than just deployment or just propagation. I won't go into specifics. I don't want to give anyone any ideas, but it's certainly something to be prepared for. As was discussed in one of yesterday's tutorials, preparation is half the battle. It's important to be aware of what the attack trends are so that you can evolve security policies and procedures and be prepared as best as possible. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you said that there is a big change in the very high rate of scanning and automated distribution. We have seen that this actually does produce pretty strong effects on global BGP stability. I mean, the rate of prefix announcements, rules, withdrawals, and so forth jumps by a factor of 20 exponentially during Ninja worm spread, and it comes back to normal against following the downward exponential trend over 4 days, okay? And this is not one point. We have seen the same for the code red V2 on July 19th. So I don't think that the guys who wrote the worms intended that. But now the genie is out of the box. We can talk offline. There is a lot of software vulnerabilities in routers that everybody knows that caused this sort of failures. We'll talk about it tomorrow.
Thank you. Thanks very much.